Hey friends, welcome back to Silverhawk Farm. If you're new here, my name is Bree and I am so ready for the fall. So today we're going to be doing some fall garden prep. I have a lot of seedlings that I started in a previous video and I will actually link down below if you want to know everything about how I start my seedlings, what I put them in for soil, what varieties specifically I started. But long story short, I started my seedlings inside and I kept them in my basement under what I use for grow lights, which are actually just really bright, very sunlight-like shop lights. These plants have been there for the last few weeks, germinating and getting a little bit bigger as well. I have time to clear out my fall garden and also giving it time for the weather to cool down a little bit because these are fall seedlings. Some of them very much do not like the heat. So I actually just brought these trays out last night and I'm starting the hardening off process. If anyone's unfamiliar, the hardening off process is just a term for what you do to transition plants from the inside to the outside because it's going to be a lot brighter. There's going to be a lot more wind. The air is going to absorb more of the water out of the soil generally than it would in an indoor environment. So you just want to be conscious of all those things and make sure that these plants are transitioning in a slow and steady pace so that you don't shock them, which can either shock them and stunt their growth or just kill them altogether. With the weather the way it is right now, it's about 80-85 degrees during the day. My garden gets too much sun. It literally gets sun from dawn to dusk. So if I were to put these that have been in my basement under lights directly out to the garden, most, if not all, of the seedlings would probably just die. They would just shrivel up. They wouldn't know how to handle that immense amount of sunlight. So the traditional way to harden off seedlings is to gradually move them out for a couple hours at a time. So I've never actually used this process because I have my hack that I'll explain in a second. But in general, if you don't have an ideal space for hardening off all at once, what you would do is you would move them out for maybe an hour one day and in a shady spot and then bring them back in, bring them out for 2 hours the next day, and then you'll slowly introduce them to more direct sunlight and more time out in the garden until they are completely acclimated to whatever level of sunlight your garden gets. So my system is a little bit different from that. So there's a spot on the east side of my house that gets only morning sun, so it gets maybe an hour of direct sun in the morning when it's really nice and cool and it's not super intense sun rays. And then as it goes throughout the day, the way that the shade works on my house is that they're fully shaded for the rest of the day. Because I have a setup like this or a spot like this, I actually just bring them out entirely and then I never move them back inside unless it's just getting way too hot that day for me to feel like they're gonna be comfortable. So I've actually moved these out to this nice shady spot. I have them up on this work table. In previous years, I would put these trays on the ground, but I actually had a whole bunch of bunnies that I actually discovered in my asparagus bed this spring. I'll pop up a photo of them. They're super cute. And while I never really had a problem with them in my crops because I chose to plant my lettuce higher up on my green stalk this year to accommodate them, I did get some of my spring seedlings eaten up, particularly the lettuce. They went after an entire tray of lettuce. So now I put them just slightly higher up, and I'm not super worried about them in the garden because it's pretty close to my dogs. I haven't seen any bunnies in the garden recently, but I may end up needing to cover some of my lettuce plants, which is fine. Once these seedlings have been here for a few days, I'm gonna start transitioning them very gradually further and further out. Because this is on the east side of my property, as the day goes by, the shade moves. So I can move this a few feet this way and get it an hour of sun without me actually having to come and move them back and forth. It won't necessarily work for you depending on your setup. You just need to think about where the sun is during the day, whether it can get some direct sun in the early morning or right before dusk, but you just want to make sure that nothing is getting that like really intense sunlight in the midday. Oh, there's a wasp on my camera. Whoa. So when you're thinking about your property, you definitely want to think about things like whether it gets sun in the early morning or in the late evening, if it gets sunlight throughout the day, if you can keep it in a shady spot and move it for a couple of hours. Those are all great options. You could also put it on the part of your home that gets a ton of shade and just move them out to a sunny spot a couple hours a day. There's lots of ways to harden off. The number one thing is just that you do something to make sure they have a chance to acclimate. Once I have mine a little bit more hardened off and used to the direct sunlight on the far end of my porch, I'm gonna go ahead and move them out to the garden for a few days, and they're gonna sit in the tray in the garden for a few days to make sure that they can acclimate to that intense level of sun that I have there. And then after that, we'll get to planting, which is great news because my garden is a mess right now. So some of these seedlings didn't come up. Some of them may have been overwatered. I feel like some of these maybe got a little bit too much water and the seedlings rotted out, but I still have a good amount of everything I want. I always overplant when I'm starting seedlings. So now that I have my seedlings pretty well established, I think the ones that are going to germinate already have, I only bottom water. So I just pull up this tray and I pour water in the bottom of it. Bottom watering will encourage your plants to send their roots down to get water, which is a good thing for developing a healthy root system. The only disadvantage to bottom watering is if a tiny seedling doesn't have enough roots yet to get that moisture, sometimes they can dry out. So I keep an eye out for smaller seedlings to make sure that I'm not giving them any disadvantage. So I will issue a quick warning before we head out to the garden that my garden is a bit of a mess. I haven't talked about it on the channel yet, but my grandfather, who I know as Daddo, passed unexpectedly, and I basically just took a month off from anything that wasn't absolutely essential to grieve and give myself time. So while I maintained the irrigation on the garden and made sure that I was harvesting anything that the garden gave me, I did not keep up with weeding. And even if I had, it's unlikely that I would have kept up with all of it. So this is paradise. I've got grass everywhere. So some parts are worse than others. Like this tomato and pepper bed here is actually doing pretty well. It's managed to keep the weeds down all right, I think because it is one of the areas that I kept up with weeding a little bit better than others. I still have some okra growing here. I still have random tomatoes up and around this area, and then a good number of tomatoes and some potatoes that are overdue for being dug up in this far bed. One thing I like to be mindful of, especially when working with like a fall garden or an early spring garden, anything that you're trying to do over winter, is I want to have easy access to this stuff when it is cold and I don't feel like being outside. So my plan right now is to clear out this bed, which is the bed that's closest to my front door, which is the way that I access my garden. There isn't anything really in there right now. I had a tomato plant that did not make it for unknown reasons that are totally not related to being overrun with weeds. And I haven't actually decided how I'm going to clear this yet. So as far as getting these areas cleared, my biggest plan is to do what's kind of like broad forking. If you're unfamiliar, a broad fork is a garden tool that you can use. It's usually quite wide and it has very strong prongs that go down and can allow you to kind of hand till the soil. It's helpful for things like getting weeds up. At one point I was planning on getting a broad fork and I was watching a billion YouTube videos, and I think it was Curtis Stone, which is a guy who does like a lot of market farming sort of information, recommended this guy, which is quite a bit shorter than a broad fork. It comes up to my hip and it's got sort of the broader prongs, but it's a lot stronger than like a normal pitchfork that I would use to shovel hay or clean up the barn. So actually this does great for me and save me probably like 150 bucks. Broad forks are expensive. So while I would like to have one someday, I like this one in the meantime. And I feel like for people with smaller frames, such as myself, it might be a little easier to manage because it really is a small thing that I feel like I can easily maneuver. Sometimes it feels like those big farm tools are just like not made for women, which is uncool. Farm companies, please make smaller things. We're out here too. And then when I'm just clearing like a normal small area, I do just use like a hand hoe. I really like this one. It's nice and sharp on this edge, which allows me to really get into those very stubborn weeds that I have throughout the garden. You do want to be extra careful with those because they are sharp. You don't want to stab yourself with it. Any sort of like hand garden hoe would also work. I have the 3-pronged one that looks like this guy. Can't find it. I was trying to find it so I could show you for an example, but those work too. Anything that you can use to just kind of get the weeds up. Another consideration is the first thing that I'm going to do is pull my irrigation to make sure that I don't accidentally hit it with either of these tools, because I don't want to have any more holes in my irrigation than I already do. If you're curious about irrigation, I actually made a video about mine and I'll drop the link below. So my question to myself is whether I can actually get this to pull up the very, very intense weeds in the bed, or if I'm gonna need to get a weed eater out and clear some of that stuff and then just pull out the roots with this guy. So I'm gonna try just this to begin with, and we're gonna see how it goes. So it is early evening now. I finished up clearing this bed here, and then I decided to go inside, cool off a little bit, shower, and take care of some indoor work. But I did manage to get this cleared, as you can see. I haven't put the irrigation back, and I probably won't for a little bit while I'm getting everything sorted, and I'm making sure that I'm getting compost and mulch on top as needed for me to plant. I figured as I'm traveling back through the garden this evening, I would look through and kind of talk about what I would do in a situation where I don't have an entire bed just to completely clear up and have available for fall plants. If I had more limited space and more of my plants were producing, a lot of people have to make the choice of whether to continue to have their summer crops going or to pull them for some fall crops. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I would make that decision if I didn't have any additional space. The number one thing that I would take into account is what is still producing. I would go through and just look at which plants look really healthy, which plants are still setting blossoms. For example, I have this beautiful, this is probably a raspberry liana. That's one of my very favorite varieties to grow, and it just does really well in my garden. So this is looking really healthy. It's got lots of new blooms. It's growing almost to the top of the trellis, which is rare for my tomatoes this season. They've been neglected almost to death, a lot of them. So to see one doing this well is great. So I would leave something like this. Whereas if I look over here, just next to it, I see that I have this plant that's kind of wilted. It's got a lot of bug damage. Clearly the bugs have gotten to it. There's a lot of dead parts coming off, and it's not setting a ton of blossoms. I think I see like 1 or 2 on the entire plant. In addition, this is a cherry tomato plant, and I have gotten a lot of cherry tomatoes, and I have a lot of cherry tomato plants that are still doing really well. So in the case that I didn't have a lot of space, I would probably end up pulling this plant. Another thing to keep in mind is your area. A lot of places this time of year, your tomatoes are already going to be gone to blight. So if that's the case, then you can go ahead and pull whatever's about lost to blight. So it looks like this one is also doing really well, but here next to it, there are a few tomato plants that ended up getting really stunted. And I'm not sure if they're going to do much for the rest of the season. So things like that, I would go ahead and pull out. You can also pull out any sort of ornamentals that aren't adding value to your garden. If you're feeling pressed for space, I would definitely be pulling any of the super warm veggies, any of the super warm things like my watermelon, my cantaloupe that are probably done for the season anyway. One thing I wouldn't dream of pulling early is the pepper plants, because peppers take so long to grow. So I always end up getting a bumper crop right at the end of the season. Usually right before my last frost, the first thing I'll have to do is go out and just pick all of the peppers for the season. So these are going to be staying in because they take forever to mature. But if you see behind them, we've got all of these really sad looking tomatoes, and I've thought about pulling them just anyway, just to clear up some space, and because it makes me sad to look at them, you know? Beyond that, if I had no room at all, I would actually not hesitate at all to grow fall crops in a bucket and a container, anything like that. Specifically, things like root crops like carrots do really well in containers because you can have a looser soil, and that looser soil allows you to get those big, beautiful, straight carrots like you'd get at the grocery store. Anytime you see carrots that are like really weirdly shaped or compacted is usually a problem with soil compaction. Because the carrot is a root, it has a hard time permeating in really tough soil. So I would definitely challenge you to try growing in a container, even if it's something that maybe it's an herb that you want to start on a patio and bring in. That's a great option for this time of year. And you can bring that inside and continue to harvest it after most of your plants have succumbed to the freeze. So I'm really eager to get my fall crops in. It's a really nice time of year to be out in the garden. It gives me a little bit of hope before the horrors of winter. I get really bad seasonal depression, so I spend a lot of time kind of just preparing for myself to be ready for winter. And I'm gonna get some really tasty food out of it at a time when I'm way less likely to get eaten alive by mosquitoes. So let me know if you're growing anything this fall, if you're starting any herbs, if you're planning on doing carrots, if you're gonna do a whole fall and winter garden, or if you're just gonna take the season off and recuperate from the summer. That's also valid too. And I'm gonna go get some dinner on the stove. I hope to see you really soon, and in the meantime, treat yourself to something delicious. Okay, bye. Bye, 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 bye.